Well, welcome everybody to this seminar by Professor Chris Andersen, who has joined us from Canada. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which I speak, the Arana people, and other Anungan groups throughout Central Australia. I'm very new to Charles Darwin University. My name is Professor Barry Judd, for those of you who do not know me yet. And I guess part of my brief here on the Alice Springs campus that I've set myself has been to generate a bit of research interest around issues that are of interest to me as someone who comes from the field of Australian Indigenous studies. So I have invited Professor Andersen from the University of Alberta to kick off a series of seminars, and I'm hoping to hold over the next few years. Chris is currently Dean of the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta and Director of the Rupert's Land Centre for Métis Research. I think I have known of Chris since around 2011, and we met through an organisation that we're both members of called the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. And Chris is one of the leading scholars within the association, and I much admire his work on issues concerning Indigeneity and Indigenous identity in particular. Since 2011, Chris and I have had many conversations about this issue, and I think especially in recent times since I have been working at Papunya in Central Australia, we've also had some great conversations about camping equipment and four-wheel drives. One of the key reason why I have invited Chris to speak here today is that I've been working in higher education around Indigenous issues for 27 years now, and there is almost a complete silence around the question of who is Indigenous. It's a question which Australian academics, and in particular academics from an Indigenous background, have been resistant to engage with in any meaningful way. Chris has commenced this work in Canada, and I think it's really important for us here in Australia to hear what he has to say about the Canadian context and perhaps find a pathway in which we can begin to engage with these questions, because many of the issues and problems, as I understand from Chris, are very similar to what happens in Australia and in the Australian higher education sector, for example. So questions might be, what does an institution do when it is contacted by a person claiming an Aboriginal identity based on an ancestor that they recently found they had, where the connection is 100 years old? These are real questions, and they're everyday questions for the sector, but they are hardly ever engaged with in a serious way. From my work in Central Australia, I also have questions about my own identity. I, of course, claim an Indigenous identity, and people in the community here accept me, but there is a real difference between the identity position that people project towards me within the university sector and the identity position that people project towards me when I'm at a place like Papunya. So in one sense, I'm an Aborigine when I'm on campus in Alice Springs, and I'm a white fella when I go to Papunya. Again, these issues are rarely discussed in the Australian context. I've probably said enough, and I'd like to now introduce Chris to tell us about these issues as they occur in Canada. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you all for coming. I, for some reason, thought it was going to be a lot hotter here than it is, and so I had to pack for 2 different trips. But it turns out basically that I packed for the Melbourne trip, and it was cold, and now I'm going to be too hot while I'm in Alice Springs. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging the sovereignty of the Indigenous owners of this territory, and I would also like to thank Barry for his kind invitation to ask me to come and speak here. I live in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Have any of you ever been to Canada? Edmonton's about a 12-hour drive to Vancouver. East, obviously, if you go west, you're in the ocean. And I'm part of a large Indigenous family, a large extended family that lives in the Parkland region of Saskatchewan, which is the next province over. And it's about a 7.5-hour drive from where my partner and I live in Edmonton at the moment. And as many of my relatives will tell you, I am a very disappointing relative. I don't go home often enough, and when I do go home, I don't stay long enough. And additionally, being an academic that I've become, most of my cousins would laugh at my poor harvesting skills, hunting, fishing, etc. But more importantly, my utter lack of musical talent with a fiddle, a guitar, or singing, which my family in particular is renowned for in the region. Nonetheless, my immediate and extended family recognize me and they claim me just as I claim them. And this claiming, this deep and complex connection to a living, breathing Indigenous family and community is fundamental to my sense of who I am as an Indigenous person. It anchors my indigeneity, and my self-identification on its own means little to me without its connection to this broader family and community context. In short, identity to me cannot be separated from my immediate and extended family and the community and the place that we live in. Now, earlier this year, one of Canada's most celebrated literary stars, novelist Joseph Boyden, was publicly challenged on his indigeneity. The combination of accusations that had been percolating for years among the Indigenous literature community in Canada. Boyden, an award-winning author and a highly sought-after speaker, was being increasingly challenged on his seemingly endless shifting claims to various Indigenous peoples. For example, by a colleague's count who, because they lack tenure, wishes to remain anonymous, Boyden has claimed more than 24 different combinations of indigeneity over the past 5 years. And with the deep nuance that social media platforms like Twitter are known for, this debate quickly devolved into an is he or isn't he binary, with supporters and detractors alike flinging increasingly acerbic accusations at one another. So if you supported him, you were colonized. If you didn't support him, then you were racist. As some of us who do work in the area of Indigenous identity attempted to wade into the debate, we were quickly drowned out by the gravitational pull that the seemingly easy framings of binaries offer. To the extent that it's possible today, I'd like us to resist the pull of the binaries on display in what has been known as the Boyden affair, in favor of a more complex and hopefully more nuanced conversation about what this debate can teach us about how indigeneity is conceived of in a contemporary recognition ecosystem of liberal nation states like Canada, and from what I can see, Australia as well, and the increasingly powerful, if unfortunate, role that self-identification has come to play in these debates. The term identity has become pretty ubiquitous these days. It's the major way that most people talk about belonging, but less well discussed is what we mean by the term identity when we use it. And it's important, it seems to me, that we crack open the otherwise polished veneer of the term to speak more complexly about what we mean when we use it and the social relations that are most important to link it to. And this all seems very abstract now, but hopefully as we go through, I'll tie this together more concretely. Indigenous scholar Glenn Coulthard has written persuasively on the limitations of a liberal politics of recognition. And I want to extend his argument by speaking about how it manifests itself in the seemingly endless identity debates that have taken hold of the Canadian public psyche, both in terms of the claims being made and in terms of the white fragility on clear display in the reactions to those claims. I see the base of these relationships as being deeply rooted in a will to recognize by which Canada, as other liberal nation states, seek to divest themselves of their colonial past, and it goes something like this. Canada was a colonial country, but through the goodness and the tolerance of its citizens, its leaders, and fundamentally its superior introspective abilities, it has been able to rise above the darkness of these earlier times to become a leader and the reconciliatory example that we see before us today. Canada really trumps itself, Trump is not a good word, Canada really plumps itself up as basically being the high watermark of liberalism. And it is in this reconciliatory context, so the narrative goes, that individuals, many of whom have faced discrimination themselves or have had parents, grandparents, and even ancestors who face discrimination, are increasingly encouraged to self-identify. Indeed, self-identification doesn't just sit at the center of Joseph Boyden's claims to indigeneity. It anchors the entire identity politics ecosystem as they pertain to claims to indigeneity in Canada. Now, at one level, placing self-identification at the center of claims to indigeneity makes obvious sense. It is central, for example, to how the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People defines indigeneity, and it's obviously much preferable to colonial legislation and regulations anchored in racist and often arbitrary criteria. Indeed, what could be fairer and more inclusive, more dignified even, than making self-identification the core of claims to indigeneity? And if not self-identification, what possibly could be used instead? As I'll make clear, well, as I hope I'll make clear, the issue isn't one of instead, but rather in addition to. I use the term self-identification, but what does it mean? At one level, it is obvious in the sense that it's who I claim to be and who anyone who makes a claim to anything claims to be. As defined by noted liberal theorist Charles Taylor, self-identification designates something like a person's understanding of who they are, of their fundamental defining characteristics as a human being. So I keep looking over here because kind of most of you are over here, but I'll send some love this way in a second. But in assuming that we always know who we are, Taylor erases the complex context within which we come to think we know who we are, and the racialized conditions of possibility within which we come to invest ourselves in such meanings. As sociologist Craig Calhoun has argued, as human beings, we are inescapably social, which means in terms that we are, quote, determined by, dependent on, and committed to other people patterns of social organization and culture. In short, self-identifying claims are never just individual claims. They are always linked to a collective, whether we are cognizant of that collective when we make the claim or not. In their controversial but nonetheless path-breaking article, Beyond Identity, Rogers Brubaker and Frederick Cooper advocate for a move away from the term identity to find more precise markers to make sense of what we're attempting to analyze. They argue persuasively that the term identity has come to be used for so many different things that it means everything and nothing at all. As I take up their offering in my move to a slightly more theoretical framing here, I want to speak to what self-identifying claims to indigeneity actually claim. That is, if our sense of self is always linked to the broader collective selves around us, family, community, history, etc., we might well ask, what actually gets claimed and what can it teach us about the substance we use to sustain claims to indigeneity? What happens and why do we use self-identification as the end-all and the be-all of making claims to indigeneity? In a much anticipated radio interview this past January, Joseph Boyden sat down with his friend and Indigenous journalist Candy Palmater to speak to his various claims to indigeneity. Though considered by many to be a softball interview, does that make sense? Softball interview? You guys use the same thing here? Yeah, okay. A softball, sometimes I'm not clear on how well sports metaphors kind of translate across national context. Though considered by many a softball interview, Palmater begins by asking him, are you Indigenous? To which Boyden replies, absolutely. I'm the person that I've always shown myself to be, both privately and in public, and my family says. I'm a white kid from Willowdale, which is a wealthy neighborhood in the city of Toronto, with Native roots. A small part of me is Indigenous, but it's a big part of who I am. Note here that Boyden is making two seemingly contradictory claims, arguing both that he is Indigenous, but also that, in his own words, he's a white kid with Native roots. As we think through this apparent contradiction, let me ask a question of the audience, rhetorically for now, but it'll land more concretely as we work through these issues. What's the difference between an Indigenous person with white ancestry and a white person with Indigenous ancestry? Clearly, being a white person with Indigenous ancestry is not only a real thing, that is, having Indigenous ancestry doesn't make one Indigenous, any more than having white ancestry makes one automatically white. It has something important to tell us about Canada's unfolding history of colonialism. I want to suggest that these dynamics together speak of the fetishization of biological notions of race. They also mean that self-identification on its own is not only not necessarily a good indicator of indigeneity, it can be a key indicator of the concrete unfolding of contemporary colonialism. More on this later. About a dozen years ago, I sat on a selection committee for a professional hire in another faculty. Following deliberations, an impressive candidate was selected, and we voted unanimously to recommend that the chair make an offer. As the meeting adjourned and we gathered our things to head back to our respective buildings, one of the committee members fell into a walk with me down the hall toward the elevator. Knowing as he did that I had come over from the Faculty of Native Studies, he disclosed, you know, I'm 1/16th Seminole Indian, which are Indigenous people in the southern United States. And in my head, I thought, okay. But trying to be polite, I asked the most appropriate question I could think of. One I would have asked anyone who self-identified as some local form of indigeneity. I asked, who's your kokum? This was, of course, a dumb question, even for me, not only because he wasn't from Alberta and didn't know Cree. Kokum is the Cree word for grandmother, or more specifically, your grandmother. So I was asking him, who's your kokum, who's your grandmother? But also because, as far as I know, Seminoles don't speak Cree. They speak Creek. It turns out that he didn't know much about his Seminole ancestry beyond his ability to fractionally quantify it. And I remember thinking, if he's not bullshitting, this old white dude is an old white dude that has Indigenous ancestry. Now, talking about race, especially in its relations to indigeneity, is always messy, as are claims to indigeneity that are rooted in race. And what I want to emphasize here today is to ask us to think about the sometimes contrasting and even conflicting social relations that we often smush together when we use the term race. And it's in the context of this equivocality that I want to emphasize what I see as the co-constituted character of race. This is not brain surgery. It's just that the thing that we use race to mean can mean different things in different contexts. And so sometimes when we use just the term race, we're hiding these different sets of social relations that are kind of lurking underneath it. Much of my career's work on the meaning of the term Métis, who are my own Indigenous peeps, for example, has explored how contemporary understandings seem endlessly mired in debates about how we're different from First Nations. So as many of you may or may not know, in Canada, there are 3 constitutional peoples. There are, in the 1982 Constitution Act, Section 35, there are Indians, now called First Nations, there are Eskimos, now called Inuit, and there are Métis. We are almost always understood as Métis in terms of our mixed Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal ancestry, as though this isn't a feature of all indigeneity. Now, certainly what we think about as race is partly encapsulated in biology and biological discourses. But let's be very clear here. Though critical, biology is only part of the complex story of race. Hence, talking, as some have, about how the lie of race is revealed in the actual practice of race in, say, 19th century colonial locales, misses the fact that race was and is only ever partly constituted by biology. Hence, these 19th century situations didn't reveal the lie of race, which is often encapsulated in the banal phrase that race is socially constructed. Rather, they demonstrate the inability of biological understandings of race to exhaust the shifting meanings and the relations of power that comprise the full complexity of race in any given context. Colonial administrators never relied just on biology to mark race, and neither do we. And it's also why the native roots that Boyden spoke about in his interview should not be enough to make claims to be Indigenous on their own. Even though people who grow up in community, people who are very secure in their Indigenous identity will also, of course, talk about their Indigenous roots and their ancestors as well. Certainly in Canada, we like to talk about how our conversations of race have shifted from biological discussions in the 19th and early 20th century to cultural discussions in the post-World War II period. This is a pretty kind of common trope about how race moves forward in terms of the way that we talk about it. But of course, cultural discourses, food, dress, language, lifestyle, moral comportment, employment, as well as a wide panoply of other factors, were always part of the grid of intelligibility of race in the 19th century. And biology continues to exert a powerful grip on how we talk about race today. as we see through Boyden's invocation of his, quote, Indigenous roots. Indeed, biological antecedents through claims to Indigenous ancestry have come to serve as a hallmark of claims to indigeneity. We may well ask, however, what sustains claims to indigeneity based largely in biological markers, and what arguably equally important markers do they marginalize? So in other words, when we use biology as the marker for race and people talk about blood quantum, whether they have it or they don't have it, and they talk about kind of links to their ancestors, what is being missed out in those kinds of conversations? And those are conversations that very heavily shape the discursive landscape of how these things are talked about in Canada. Now, of course, I'm arguing that there are limits to self-identification on its own to sustain claims to indigeneity. And a question, again, we might ask is why someone would want to self-identify as Indigenous when they're not? Because this is often, when I get into discussions with people, when I get called exclusionary or racist or whatever, they say, well, but why? Why would someone say they're Indigenous when they're not? I have a number of answers for that. As Boyden's interview asked him, did he think it was unfair that people were not accepting of his self-identification, that they were asking for more? So this is something you often see if people are making self-identifying claims, and then someone asks them, well, where are you from? Where are your people from? Where's your community from? Then they go, how dare you ask me a question like that? So why is it that they feel that way, and why is that there's a particular emotional or affective relationship when those things come around? Often, many hear stories in their families about grandmothers who were darker than you would expect. For example, I once met a student on my campus who began to self-identify as Indigenous based on this reason, that he found a photo of his grandmother, and she was way darker than you would think a white person would look, so therefore she must be Indigenous, and therefore he must be Indigenous. Hushed conversations that would have embarrassed mothers or fathers only a generation ago are now available for discussion in this new period of Canadian, and I assume as well, Australian enlightenment. Having said that, many people are aware of Indigenous ancestors in their family, but self-identify as something else, usually white. They note it or not, and they move on with their lives as they lived before and will live after, because they don't see themselves as Indigenous. And they can remark on the fact that they have indigeneity in their family, but that's not the context that they grew up in. Nonetheless, there are those for whom being white is apparently an unbearable state of being. Several years ago at a university symposium, I and several colleagues presented together on our new books, each of which was just out or was due to come out shortly. About a 45-minute presentation from each of us, and then questions from the audience. During lunch, an instructor from one of the local colleges came up to me and politely but firmly challenged me on my definition of indigeneity, in terms of what she described as my exclusionary rhetoric, arguing that she was Indigenous because she was mixed, because she had native roots. If that was okay for some Indigenous people to make that claim, why not for her? When I explained to her that the core of being Indigenous was not about mixedness and not about roots, but about peoplehood, she cut off the conversation by snapping, I just don't want to be white, okay? People who make claims to indigeneity, who attempt to non-relationally possess indigeneity, based only on individual claims or to selected ancestors or to communities of their choosing, are encouraged to do so by liberal nation states like Canada that are mired in damage or deficit-based understandings of indigeneity. These individualizing claims are thus often cloaked in an accompanying claim to innocence. These individualizing claims are thus often cloaked in an accompanying claim to innocence. The possessiveness at the base of this claiming thus operates as both sword and shield, at once deeply imperial and equally deeply invested in self-righteous victimhood and entitlement. For example, this is often an argument used by those who talk about their ancestors, quote, hiding in plain sight, or, quote, passing as white, due to the racism they faced. And these arguments often extend back to include multiple centuries of ancestors. So in other words, people will say, well, because of what happened to my ancestors 200 years ago, they had to pass as white. So, okay, so your ancestors passed as white for 200 years. So they became white 200 years ago, and now you're making claims to indigeneity based on the fact that your ancestors were white for 200 years. Claiming indigeneity is never an innocent act, regardless of the claimant's intent, and the tears and the pain that they say they feel, and I'm sure they do, must be tempered by the realization that colonialism has ensured that there's lots of tears and lots of pain to go around. So I find I've become much more hard-hearted as I've been kind of working on these kinds of issues because people just start crying. It's not for no reason. I mean, they have a particular relationship to the things they're talking about, but people will cry at the drop of a hat, and I've just become kind of a nerd to those kinds of tears because they come to be these conversation stoppers rather than having a real discussion about what we mean by the term identity. Now, of course, our choices, our abilities, and opportunities to act are always differentially positioned, prefigured by the material and the symbolic realities of colonialism that we find ourselves in. Just really a snotty way of saying that some people are in a better position to act on these things than others. Not everyone has the same ability or choice to act on and constitute ourselves anew, or for that matter, would they feel a desire to. Joseph Boyden is a perfect example of hierarchies, since he kind of sits at the very top of the literary hierarchy in Canada. Nonetheless, these dynamics of self-making operate according to what I regard as two key features of modern identity politics. First, that individual self-understanding is the most important element in a larger dynamics of identity making. And second, that identity is not just something you are, but it's something you can become. White possessiveness, which I'll describe further in a moment, is thus rooted first in the idea that as liberal subjects, we know who we are, and therefore we are always who we say we are. And second, that since we are always in the process of becoming, to use Stuart Hall's framing of identity, we can become whomever we want to be. And given the colonial context within which all of this takes place, these dynamics are fundamentally premised on the notion that if somebody wants something, the mere fact of their desire means they should be able to take it and to have it, to possess it. This is an ontological hallmark of white possessiveness. Now, what do I mean about white possessiveness? When I talk about white possessiveness, I'm not talking about white people, although there may be many people that fit this description. I'm talking about a particular structure that sits in the context of Canadian colonialism, and from what I can tell, Australian colonialism as well. Extending Lipset's discussion about the possessive investment in whiteness, Aileen Morton Robinson has explored and concretized the term in an explicitly Indigenous context. Taking the emergence of the possessive subject to the transition from feudalism to modernity and the emergence of political and economic individualism, Morton Robinson explores how indigeneity and Indigenous peoples came to be known and owned, at least in the thinking of colonial administrators, known and owned, at least in their own thinking, by white colonizers and bureaucrats. With the growth of colonial imperialism, Indigenous peoples came to be constituted in and deployed by racial discourse as white social constructs and as epistemological discussions. That's Aileen's words and not mine. Her argument resonates in novel ways with Edward Said's depiction of colonialism, in which the Oriental was an invention of European intellectuals and colonial bureaucrats for the purposes of settlement, government, and categorization. Now, Morton Robinson positions the growth of white possessiveness in two critical senses, as intra- and intersubjective phenomena. Regarding the former, we can think of the intimate relationship between liberalism and Homo economicus, that is, men who are sufficiently evolved to enjoy the economic fruits of liberalism through a mature self-possession. Those who did not or could not display sufficient maturity left themselves open to the regimes of discipline that constituted a crucial element of liberalism. So one of the discussions you see in liberal philosophy is people talking about the dark side of liberalism. So we think of liberalism as being kind of this fairly unqualifiedly good thing, but yet if you look deeper into it, you see kind of this dark side of it. But of course, if you look empirically at the past, there's nothing, the dark side of liberalism is liberalism. It's always been the flip side of liberalism. For people, business people, other people who were considered what we would now call minorities, people who didn't demonstrate and act in appropriate ways, that was the whole point of discipline, because they weren't acting like fully mature humans. And in fact, Barry Hindis has referred to this as what he calls the unfreedom of liberalism. So regarding the latter, this idea of intersubjective possessiveness, Dr. Morton Robinson writes that, quote, and this is a bit of a dense quote, but I'll read it out and then I'll explain it. At the ontological level, the structure of a subjective possession occurs through the imposition of one's will to be on the thing that is perceived to lack will, and thus is open to being possessed. This enables the formerly free subject to make the thing its own. In other words, white possessiveness regards indigeneity as passive and inert, and thus open to being claimed. The entire doctrine of terra nullius, for example, is based precisely on this worldview. But of course, indigeneity isn't just about individual self-possession, or as I've been talking about it, self-identification. It isn't about how we feel. It isn't about what we desire. It isn't about what we think we own, what we feel we are owed, or what we wish to possess, even, or perhaps especially, when that possession is identity. Indigeneity, as the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association laid out in their recent statement about integrity and ethnic fraud, is thus not just about who you claim to be, it's about who claims you. And there's a deep reciprocality of relationality that endures and that must endure even in the face of the sometimes heartbreaking discussions about the meteor-like impact of colonialism on historical Indigenous communities. And this isn't a hard-hearted stance, but rather it's a stark reminder of the fact that the possessive colonial desires that wrung some Indigenous communities dry historically continue to confront us and to confront Indigenous communities today. Now, believe me, as I built up my thinking and writing on these issues, I realized that challenging the indigeneity of recovering or recovered identities is anathema to a liberal politics of recognition, which is anchored crucially in the requirement that we confess our indigeneity in terms that are intelligible to the Canadian state and to those deeply committed to the myth of Canada's innate virtue. Nonetheless, self-identification on its own must be treated as suspect. Our reality of colonialism is that non-Indigenous people can choose when and how they engage in relations with Indigenous people, and unfortunately, individualized and individualizing claims to indigeneity comprise an increasingly acute vector of that possessiveness. Right? So non-Indigenous people can choose when and how they have relationships with Indigenous people in ways for which the opposite is rarely, if ever, true. So if non-Indigenous people want to choose to act in respectful ways, they can, but if they want to act in the context of thinking through stereotypes and not acknowledging the complexity of our communities and the peoples, they can do that as well. That's part of the privilege of being non-Indigenous, and in particular, part of the privilege of being white. And this isn't to lump together all those who self-identify as Indigenous but lack easy or luxurious connections to family or community. Separation or even rejection from Indigenous community, which is a reality of 21st century Canadian colonialism, and with the stolen generations phenomena here in Australia as well. But this is a much different thing than having no connection at all. But we may all recognize how the realities of adoption, of state apprehension, of heteronormativity, and the patriarchy of a legal system that specifically targets Indigenous women will complicate the kinds of relationships that Indigenous people can have with Indigenous communities. But a complex relationship to a contemporary Indigenous community is emphatically not the same thing as having no relationship, or making claims to an Indigenous community gone for 2 centuries or more, which is what's happening a lot in Canada right now, is just trying to get these people who are calling themselves Indigenous based on connections to a fur trade community that's been gone for 300 years. And I don't just mean hiding in plain sight, I mean obliterated, and it's now where Detroit is, for example. Nor does recognition mean the same thing as acceptance. We can be acknowledged as so-and-so's cousin or granddaughter or nephew without necessarily being accepted as gay or transgender or any number of non-heteronormative people can attest to. Indigenous communities are not without their own investments in colonial categories and structures of power. Recovered identities that take place in the dynamics other than what I just mentioned, namely relationality, often rely on claims to innocence in the manner in which Tuck and Yang frame it. Quote, settlers locate or invent a long-lost ancestor who is rumored to have had Indian blood, a claim used to mark themselves as blameless in the attempted eradications of Indigenous people. White possessiveness and the claims to innocence that often accompany it become, in the words of popular Canadian-based Indigenous blogger Chelsea Vowell, who's now one of my graduate students, quote, a way to claim indigeneity without the muss or fuss of having to connect to relatives or to community or to place, other than those of their choosing. And I keep saying other than those of their choosing, and I'll explain why in a second. This whole idea of indigeneity without responsibility sits at a deep well of dubious claims to indigeneity, and it is dependent upon what anthropologist Cersei Sturm terms, quote, a presumed void of Indianness. In other words, since all real Indigenous people are gone, people should be able to self-identify as they please. In her book, Becoming Indian, Sturm explores the complex reasons why people began to make claims to being Cherokee, emphasizing the extent to which her interlocutors understood whiteness as an empty experience. Manifesting the unmarkedness of whiteness that a broad whiteness studies literature has traced the genealogies of, these racial shifters were able to deny their whiteness by claiming Cherokee-ness, a claim they were able to make because in their mind, all the real Cherokees were dead. And clearly, these kinds of narcissistic personal ventures rooted in self-actualization projects with little thought to reciprocity or accountability fit neatly within a liberal recognition ecosystem that has encouraged self-identification. So, if self-identification is not enough on its own to buoy claims to indigeneity, how can you tell the difference between real and fake Indigenous claims? I mean, isn't that what we're here for today, to talk about the difference between those two? And as many of you hopefully are thinking, real and fake is not an especially helpful binary for understanding these issues. Instead, I want to encourage us to think about claims to indigeneity in the context of relationships to family and community, and more specifically to think in terms of relational rather than non-relational communities. Indigeneity involves an intricate mix of self-understanding that's linked to place and feelings of allegiance to and by Indigenous community in all the complex ways that community and place are and can be defined. So it's not like I'm going to sit here and tell you, okay, everyone's talking about self-identification as being the end-all and be-all of making claims to indigeneity. That's not cool. What we should really be talking about is community. There, I fixed everything. The point is, the kinds of dynamics, the kinds of complexities, and the kinds of questions you get when you turn the lens onto community are, in my mind, a much higher order than the kinds of questions you get when you talk about self-identification. Because when you talk just about self-identification, those almost always just fall into binaries about, well, is he or isn't he? Well, is she or isn't she? Well, if you say she's not, that means you are internally colonized, those kinds of things. Whereas when we move the discussion into a discussion around community, then we start asking questions about, okay, what place is the community linked to? What do you mean by community? Do you mean community or do you mean a particular geographical settlement? There's just this huge and really useful set of questions that we can start thinking about. Place possesses essential status in a relational understanding of community. And it means we need to think about how our historical, storied relationships of territory and diplomacy with other Indigenous peoples shape contemporary claims to and by Indigenous community, right? I'm using the term community here a lot, but sometimes I don't like using the term community because people often think about it in the context of settlement. For my people who are extremely mobile, the idea of a settlement didn't make a lot of sense. We were part of the larger people that moved in migratory ways into particular areas and out of particular areas where we had rights to be in the area and we had kinship relationships with other people who were moving in and out of those areas as well. Sorry, when I give these little asides, I'm going to go back. Place possesses essential status in a relational understanding of community, and it means that we need to think about how our historical, storied relationship to territory and diplomacy with other Indigenous peoples shape contemporary claims to and by Indigenous community. Not in a pre-encounter context, which in Canada we would call pre-contact, but in a pre-colonial context. A difference in Canada, at least several hundred years. Claims to indigeneity based solely on individual self-identification or that link to an understanding of community uninterested in relationality to people and to place operate as a form of white possessiveness because they marginalize Indigenous communities and people's power to shape the boundaries and the contours of our citizenship. And they work to eviscerate our ability to claim and to be claimed in ethical ways. This remains a crucial point, especially in instances where someone raised outside of their family or community context through no fault of their own, only recently discovering their Indigenous identities or, quote, their Indigenous roots. So if you grew up outside of community, even if it wasn't for no reason on your own, you were apprehended out, you were adopted out, your parents moved away for work, et cetera, all obvious reasons why someone wouldn't grow up in community, wouldn't know anything about their family, but that doesn't give people a pass in terms of thinking about what indigeneity actually means. So let me conclude now by moving back to a discussion about these matters of identity in the context of reconciliation. This is fitting, given that it's Reconciliation Week here in Australia, and the reason I know that is because every plane I've been on in the last week, they recognize the traditional owners of the territory that we're on. And also, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action is experiencing widespread implementation in Canada. And my point here isn't to pile on for those who grow up outside of community, nor is it to create a litmus test for determining indigeneity. The only people who can tell you whether or not you're Indigenous are your relatives. Nonetheless, levying charges of colonial policing against anyone who seeks to have a conversation about the social relations and the discourses that circulate through this debate are not only intellectually lazy, but morally dubious, because it assumes that the kinds of categories that we use to make sense of our identity, whether or not we actually talk about it, history, ancestry, roots, blood quantum, etc., are not themselves intimately part of the growth of the colonial machinery that has built the physical and symbolic spaces that we live in today. So when someone self-identifies as Indigenous, it never stops at just saying, well, I should say it rarely stops at just saying, I self-identify as Indigenous. They always have some type of second order thing that they can tie it back to. Whether they say, look, I have blood quantum, look, I'm connected to this particular historical community. So whenever we hear the term identity, it rarely stops at identity. Identity becomes this thing that's used to talk about other things. And it depends on the person that you're talking to as to what those other things actually will be. For myself, I can't imagine a notion of indigeneity that doesn't include a discussion about family and community. And a question we might ask ourselves is this: if we are willing to accept self-identification as the only or the most central marker of indigeneity, how do we think through the reality that non-Indigenous peoples, rooted both in a white possessiveness and a white fragility, will continue to make claims based precisely in a mythological or even imagined community that isn't theirs to claim? And I'll return here to the Joseph Boyden interview because I've never seen a more robust example of this possessiveness. Boyden writes, quote, well, that is an interview, so Boyden says, quote, I am as much land as I am anything. Our family, so much of them has ended back up on the land where we are from. This is who we are. We are as much grounded in the land as anyone. And that is a big, huge part of who I am. And I am in no way ashamed to continue to say that, quote, I am a white kid from Willowdale with native roots, and this is always who I've been, and I've never changed from that, unquote. The problem, of course, is that even though he's saying the land, what he means, what he has to mean, is that it's his land, since he's claiming it for himself and his family. And this is an act of imperialism that is as old as colonialism itself. And in closing, I'm reminded of Dr. Fiona Nichols' important differentiation in our uses of reconciliation between reconciling with and reconciling to. In other words, in the spirit of reconciliation, claims to Indigenous identity must include voices and knowledge that comes from Indigenous communities. If we otherwise accept the power of individual self-identification, we should reconcile ourselves further to the possessive desires of non-Indigenous people as they continue to lay claim to what is not theirs to claim. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thought-provoking, as always. We have around 10 or 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So do we have any questions?
Thanks for an interesting talk. I should start by saying I have absolutely no claim to indigeneity, and I can trace my white ancestors back quite a long way. It's my understanding that the accepted definition in Australia is a little bit more than someone who identifies as an Aboriginal person, but goes on to say, and is accepted as such by their local Aboriginal community. And it seems to me that that covers pretty much most of what you've been saying.
In Canada, it's a similar argument that that's what the kind of the legal definition is, but the problem is that in a kind of a public context, people will very often do the first, but not actually do the second. So when we think in a Canadian context, from a legal perspective, depending on the legal context you find yourself in, can be a bit more precise or a bit less precise. But yes, those two parts of the definition are what come out of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But that's not, like, say in a university context, for example, or in a government employee context, you'll often get people who'll self-identify as Indigenous, and then people get scared to ask them, where's your family from or where's your community from? And so they then glide on that first thing without having any discussion about the second chunk of it, as you just pointed out. Yeah.
Can I just say something to that? There's a three-part definition here which is applied by the Commonwealth Government to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The federal government doesn't get into the business of wanting to define any other group in Australia. So that's one thing, and it seems inconsistent to some extent with the principle of self-determination for Indigenous peoples in United Nations forums. The three parts to the definition are: you must have ancestry, you must identify as an Indigenous person, and you must be accepted by the community. But the definition doesn't say what community is. So it could be non-Indigenous community, in fact.
But actually, it's a good point, because in Canada we get this as well. We're getting an increasing number of groups who are now starting to self-identify as Indigenous, and these are largely online groups, but they're making claims in particular areas where Indigenous people already live. And so the Indigenous people are saying to them, who the hell are you guys? Like, where are you coming from? And they're saying, you're racist. If you're not accepting us, that's because you've internalized colonialism. And so you start to see the way in which that notion of community starts to get complex really quick.
Any other questions for Chris?
Thanks. Thanks, Chris. That was a really interesting and thought-provoking talk. I was just going to share something on the identification first. I was working as an anthropologist in at Umwa, which is in the far north of South Australia, quite remote. And I got a call from a bloke in Adelaide who identified as Indigenous, and he was calling because he wanted to get I suppose the support of an Aboriginal organisation to support an application. I think it might have been a bureaucratic application for ab study or something like that. And so my sense was that that the organisation or the community that identified him as Indigenous was perhaps an Aboriginal organisation. The thing was, as far as we could ascertain, he didn't have any connections to Anangal groups in northern South Australia, and perhaps his connections were more around Adelaide. So I don't know why he was calling a small organisation in northern South Australia, but that was just an aside. I was just going to say I was reflecting on the fact that in an Australian context or in any nation state, the ways that the state identifies you as a citizen of that nation, the pathways to identification are quite clear. You're either born there, your parent, patriality or matriality or so on. So, whereas identification in this sense is very much a sort of fuzzy and ill-defined thing, and whether or not it should be more rigorously defined would be an interesting question to debate. I was also going to say I work in native title, and in terms of self-identification, the native title groups are essentially self-identifying groups that then have to test that identification either in court or through consent determination. But on a more subtle level, within the claim group, who's in or out is also identified by the group. And so you've got those inclusionary principles applying at that level. So I think you could scale that up to, whether you identify as, whether you're accepted as Indigenous, or at a group level, whether you're accepted as a member of the group, is a similar thing on perhaps a finer scale. And something that I've observed in that case is that whether or not people are accepted, and this often is a question that's raised when people have been, their ancestors or antecedents have left the area, and perhaps they no longer have a contemporary connection to the area. They may be known to be family, but perhaps distant, or they haven't had a close relationship. But it's sometimes contingent on the specific circumstances. So, for instance, if there's access to, potential access to resources like mining royalties and so on, then there can be sometimes a more exclusionary approach, whereas if it's in a different context, perhaps it's more inclusionary. Yeah, anyway, that were just a couple of reflections I had on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Very similar things going on in Canada, especially in the context of casino royalties or what we call per capita distributions. It's the same set of dynamics, and the same lens can be brought to it. They're making arguments about who's in and who's out. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a discussion about who's in and who's out. These places aren't Mobius strips, right? There's an inside and an outside. But for me, the interesting thing is what are the actual kind of criteria that they're using to make differentiations between kind of inside and outside? And what's the difference between that and the criteria that are actually getting used? And so, in other words, people will be invested in particular ways in particular kind of categories. They'll say, well, Ganawagi, just south of Montreal, which is a Mohawk community, is very heavily invested in notions of blood quantum. And they always kind of get dinged for, every 4 or 5 years they will kick off white people who are living with Indigenous people on that particular First Nation, and then everyone throws up their arms in the air and says this is disgusting, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the more than 600 First Nations in Canada, something like 25% of them have similar kinds of criteria around that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I mean, that inside and that outside is always going to come through kind of those types of discussions, and it's always going to be precipitated by issues around resource extraction, wealth, and that kind of stuff. But if you scale that down to a university context, you get the same kind of discussion in reverse. You get med schools, you get law schools who are trying to put seats aside or trying to put dollars aside to bring people in, and then they get really, really hinky about whether or not how to go about defining indigeneity and how to make it narrower. So in the context that you're talking about, people trying to make it narrower, in the university context, they almost always run by non-Indigenous people. They try and make it broader because they don't want to get caught up in any human rights discussions or what have you. Yeah.
Chris, I remember the first time.
Thank you, Chris. That was fantastic, very thought-provoking. I remember the first time that I came across the paperwork for a claim of indigeneity, which only came when I first moved to Alice Springs and started to work in an Aboriginal Arts Centre. And I was helping write the grant application for the Arts Centre. And the National Arts Board required certification of Aboriginality of the artists, which the artists thought was absolutely hysterical. And they had no paperwork to prove their Aboriginality. And, this was a new thing to them and they really found it quite funny. But then we realised that, for me, it then became, oh my goodness, here's a little bureaucratic tangle because, I need to get this application in. There's something about this paperwork. We don't have access to it. Birth certificate, you can go on for hours to talk about what it's like for people to get that documentation. So in the end, I just took photos. Well, I thought if you couldn't tell, from an image that the artist was Aboriginal, then you shouldn't really be in the arts board, you know. But yeah, so I'm very interested in the visual and in visual literacy and that kind of thing. And I'm also interested, I think there's probably something very interesting in the identity, the sense of identity and people's own senses, but also community sense of identity, of the look of people, and the projections of those kinds of things. So, yeah. Yeah.
I get flack for this a lot, but I don't. So the big kind of the big colonial measure that always gets excoriated in Canada is this idea of blood quantum. So they brought in these notions of who was more or less, in this case, would have been status Indian, and over time, the system, because it was patriarchal, tended to cut out status Indian women and their children. But to me, when you think through Kim Tallbear, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Alberta, there's this very famous chart of different blood quantums going all the way to, I think, 256th or something like that. And everyone was just remarking at all, that's disgusting that the colonial state would do this. And Kim kind of looked at people and Kim said, well, it's interesting, you guys see fractions, I see relatives. So when you look in the context of people who are less fractionalized, it's not causative of anything, simply because you've got a particular blood quantum here doesn't mean that you know something you're doing. But it is broadly correlated with the kinds of things that we think about in terms of community connection, in terms of links to place, those kinds of things, right? So, yeah, I mean, and there are several celebrated examples in Canada of people who look really Indigenous, but who are adopted out, and so they get lifted up in a particular way. But that's not usually the norm. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to see the way, because the alternative, not using that, is to get into discussions around lineal descent, which is this kind of ancestor for 200-300 years ago. I make this joke a lot with my students. I don't know, did you guys have this game in Australia in the 70s and 80s called Hungry Hungry Hippo, where you drop the balls in the middle and then the hippos? Well, that's like white possessiveness. So you can't kind of use, so basically it was a board, and then you drop balls in the middle, or something like that, and then there's I don't know why it was a hippopotamus, but there's a hippopotamus at each corner, and he started banging on the end of it, and the hippopotamus would grab balls, and whoever had the most balls by the end of it won that particular round. But this is the way it works when you think about when non-Indigenous people kind of make claims to indigeneity. It's this kind of hungry hippo kind of phenomenon. And so I think it's really important to think past these kind of very liberal, and I think relatively lazy discussions, you know, and to get beyond kind of blood quantum as just being one thing, because, you know, as Indigenous people, we recognize parts of ourselves in the sets of social relations that things like blood quantum encapsulate. Yeah. It's very interesting though. Yeah.
We probably have time for just one more question, if there's any.
If you were giving advice to the Australian government, what advice would you see as paramount if you could from your experience?
Yeah, I'll give advice that's not going to seem like it's that useful, but it is absolutely paramount to start treating partners, treating Indigenous people not as problems to be solved, but as partners to be engaged with, and all the different things that come with that in the context of both local and national organizations and local and national communities. Because until we can get to that part where people in government see Indigenous people as having good things to contribute to a conversation that's they might not have thought of, as opposed to being these poor downtrodden folks that have all these really deep problems that need to be solved. We're never going to get, you know, beyond where we are right now in terms of thinking about what identity looks like. Because it's in Canada, it's the Canadian government and it's the Canadian public consciousness that's pushing these kinds of things forward. Because every time a new person kind of pops up and self-identifies, you know, the journalists and documentaries and all these different things kind of pop up out of nowhere, but people aren't talking to Indigenous communities in that context. Or when Indigenous communities have kind of narrower criteria, then they kind of cut and say, well, you know, we did this. They were much more forgiving and much more open back then than they are now, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that the whole idea of partners to be engaged with has to be fundamental to what any solution looks like.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.